From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
We're rolling. Today is Monday, June 6, 2011. My name is Joe Mosnier of the Southern Oral History Program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm with videographer John Bishop. We are in Atlanta, Georgia at Cascade United Methodist Church to complete an oral history interview for the Civil Rights History Project, which is a joint undertaking of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we are especially privileged and very pleased today to be with Reverend Joseph Lowery. Reverend Lowery, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
You're quite welcome. You'll get a bill in the mail.
I thought I might, as we're going to be talking here today, mostly about, I think, the 50s and 60s, and then a few questions thereafter, mostly 50s and 60s, and I thought I would take you back to Warren Street United Methodist and have you talk a little bit about Mobile, Alabama, and Alabama more generally in the 50s, and what you encountered there, and how you began to lead your congregation and participate in efforts to change the...
Well, I went to Mobile, Alabama, to Warren Street Church in 1952, and the NAACP was holding its regular meetings in Warren Street, so I just jumped right in with them because we had not organized SCLC at the time. SCLC came into being in the latter part of the 50s, following the Montgomery boycott. But the NAACP was active, and as I said, they met in Warren Street Church, usually on Sunday afternoon. And so I had already been active in the NAACP in earlier years, and so it was just a natural for me to join with them. And we engaged in voter registration and in educational activities designed to help African Americans understand our predicament and how it was incumbent upon us to find a way out. And it was an interesting journey. The NAACP was headed by a man named John LaFleur, who was active in Mobile. And until my arrival, I don't guess John had any competition for activism in the city. He and I became friends, and then later the friendship experienced a meltdown as we sort of went our separate ways in terms of activism. John was a typical NAACP and a great person, but his forte and probably the maximus of his activism was filing suits and writing up complaints and protests against what happened. But Mobile was an interesting town. It was racist, but not the same toxic racism that you found in Birmingham and Montgomery. So that even during later years when the movement became prominent and active, you didn't read as much about Mobile as you did Montgomery and Birmingham, because Mobile was, in many instances, quietly effecting change, and there had to be an occasional explosion of activism to keep them honest. But Mobile had some interesting leadership. A guy named Joe Langan, who was a Roman Catholic, was a city commissioner, and he was a man with a warm heart and did not have the cold and icy stare of the heart toward the black community. And so in many instances we were able to achieve change without the disruption of the community that we had to have later to achieve even more drastic change. But Mobile was sort of like a little New Orleans. As a matter of fact, the people in Mobile claim that the Mardi Gras was initiated in Mobile, not New Orleans. I never bothered to research that to decide where it come down. But Mobile, the Roman Catholic influence did not lend itself to activism in terms of change, social change, so that resolutions and lawsuits and that sort of thing, the main focus of the civil rights movement. And as the years progressed, activism progressed, and we moved away from just resolutions and statements and so forth to activism, to sit-ins and march-ins and other things. And
I'm sorry.
When the Montgomery Improvement Association, when the boycott started, I was president of the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance, and we carried the first $1,000, I think, which was a lot of money at that time, from the churches in Mobile to the Montgomery Improvement Association. And I spoke at the mass meeting at night. When I announced we had a paper sack full of money, the crowd went wild, because that was the first outside support they had received for the boycott, and they were very happy about that. And then later we initiated our own bus movement in Mobile, which went off much smoother than it did in Birmingham. And again, I credit Joe Langan, his leadership with the city commission, for the attitude that existed. The ministers decided that since I was president of the Ministerial Alliance, I ought to ride the Pritchett route, which was perceived to be the most dangerous, volatile route. KKK had considerable roots in Pritchett, and so we chose one day to ride. We'd had workshops. We had people down from Fellowship of Reconciliation to lead workshops on how to conduct nonviolent demonstrations. And so we met that morning, and everybody cleansed themselves, purged themselves of weapons, and had prayer, and we took out on the bus route, sitting in the front of the bus. And Reverend S.M. McCree, who was pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Mobile, was my partner, and we rode on the first seat that faced the front on the bus, going toward Pritchett. I think it was number 5. And not long before we got started, a fella got on the bus with a sack in his hand, with obviously a bottle in his sack, and he sat down on the little side seat right behind the driver. And at first he didn't notice us, but as he experienced a sobering ride to Pritchett, he recognized that here were 2 black people sitting on the front seat. And so he told the bus driver to make us move. And the bus driver told, you just ride and leave the driving to me. And he said, by God, if you don't make 'em move, I'll make 'em move. And so he stood up. And there was our first opportunity to put into practice the nonviolent tactics that we had learned in the workshop. And the bus driver, in the meantime, was pulling the bus over. He was going to intervene, I think. And Reverend McCree punched me with his arm, looked like he put his hand in his pocket. I said, uh-oh. And anyway, the fellow kept coming. I said, sir, please be seated. It's dangerous to stand up while the bus is moving. And I know you don't want to get hurt. We don't want to see you get hurt. And you mean us no harm. We mean you no harm. Please sit down. And everybody held their breath, not knowing what their reaction would be. And believe it or not, he sat down. and we were the most, two black preachers, probably the most surprised people on the bus. And in 2 more stops, he got up and got off the bus, slammed the door. He was very angry. He said something back to the bus driver. I don't remember what he said. Then we rode on to the preacher to the end of the line, and there were some black people on the front. When we got off, we mentioned to one of the ladies, she said, y'all segregating the buses? I said, yeah, we're segregating the buses. I said, aren't you tired of having to ride in the back? She said, yeah, I guess so. She said, but I've been back there so long, I'm not sure how I feel right now, but I'm glad y'all doing it. We said, thank you. And so we caught another bus going back to town. That was the end of the experience that was worth sharing in Mobile. But Mobile, as I said, was racist, but the racism wasn't as toxic.
Let me take our conversation toward Montgomery.
All
I'm
right.
just going to stop for just. Okay, we're back after a quick pause. Reverend Lowery, let me have you describe, if you would, those very busy and tumultuous months through late 55 through 56 in the boycott, and how that context would give rise to SCLC. And in part, originally, I think because Alabama state officials, of course, had come down so hard on the NAACP, that there was a place now for a group of ministers, pastors, to begin organizing.
Well, of course, the Montgomery Improvement Association was organized to handle the boycott. NAACP was outlawed in Alabama. And Governor Patterson saw to it that, he demanded the role, membership role. And of course, NAC refused to give it because that meant they were going to harass the members. And so they held the NAACP in contempt and eventually went to court. But the people refused to give up the membership rolls, and the Montgomery Improvement Association was organized. Dr. King, Dr. Abernathy were the leaders, and Dr. King's leadership was pivotal in the effectiveness of the boycott, and that even when they bombed his house, he challenged the crowd to go home and not return an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that we were on the right side, and that we'd win because we were on God's side. And that movement, of course, spread to other places, Tallahassee, Baton Rouge, and other places, and that led us to the experience that I mentioned earlier, our riding on the bus. That was after the Montgomery people had begun their initiative. And the conversation among leaders of the movement in Tallahassee and Birmingham with Fred Shuttleworth, Tallahassee with C.K. Steele, in Nashville with Kelly Miller Smith, in Baton Rouge with T.J. Jemison. All of us came together to meet in Atlanta. and we decided that we were going to organize a Southwide movement to strengthen each other, support each other, and to have a national impact. And while we were meeting in Atlanta, they bombed Ralph's home and church, and we adjourned the meeting and reconvened later in New Orleans. And so the official birthplace of SCLC was New Orleans, and only because we interrupted the meeting in Atlanta so that Ralph could go home and see about his church at home and family. And of course, the great turmoil ensued in Montgomery and Birmingham. Fred Shuttlesworth leading in Birmingham, and Martin and Ralph in Montgomery had a big mass meeting one night in Montgomery, and we drove up, and when we got there, the Klan had already seized the town, as it were, and we ended up not being able to get to the church. The Klan so we went to the hotel, and the old Benmore Hotel, and while we were hiding, I guess as it were, in the old hotel, we were cut off from the church. And Martin called Attorney General, and they dispatched law enforcement to the church, and disaster was avoided. But that was the beginning of SCLC, who we decided that we'd have a Southwide organization, and we could strengthen each other and spread the movement across the nation.
Sure.
And Dr. King was elected president, and I was one of the vice presidents. Well, I think I was elected secretary at first and later vice president. But that was the beginning of SCLC.
Let me ask a couple more questions about that period when SCLC is coming into being. Did you have much contact with Bayard Rustin?
Yes, Bayard came down to Montgomery
Yeah.
several times and met with us in pulling together the written theses that formed the basis for SCLC, and he was very helpful in that, and he was a brilliant man, and we welcomed his assistance, and he didn't charge us anything, which was good because we didn't have anything. So no charge, no debt. But Bayard Rustin, yes, he came down several times and worked with us for a long time. Later, there developed some differences in the movement, and but Bayard was a very influential figure in pulling together the paperwork, particularly for the early days of SCLC.
Let me ask if you would just reflect a little bit on young Reverend Dr. King's emergence through those several years.
Well, Dr. King, of course, emerged in Montgomery, leading that boycott. It was the first time that a city with 50,000 black people had successfully and effectively implemented a boycott. Their houses were bombed, threats came, but Dr. King stuck to the nonviolent motif and led the people to accept nonviolence. Many of them accepted nonviolence because they had confidence in leadership, not because they were convinced that nonviolence was necessarily the best way, because I remember in Mobile, some of the ministers that worked with me used to tell me point blank, I'm not going on this march with you because I'm not sure I can be nonviolent. Well, don't go. If you can't be nonviolent, don't go, because you'll bring harm to the movement if you resort to violence. We have to take clean hands, and of course Martin's leadership was recognized. Montgomery boycott for over a year was effective. First time in our history we've been able to sustain that kind of boycott for that long a period of time. So he was heralded across the nation and then across the world as a nonviolent leader, and of course his eloquence as a speaker, his personality as a minister and a pastor was extremely effective, and he became the natural leader. And when we organized SCLC, it was natural. He was the first person who came to mind as a president, and went on to give the kind of leadership that justified our confidence in him.
In those early first few years, late 50s, for SCLC, much of the day-to-day work through the late 50s was carried by Miss Ella Baker, and I wonder if you could share some recollections.
Ella was, I guess, the first real executive director, full-time executive director that we had. We had a fellow named Emmy Tilley, who came out of Baltimore, who had done an effective voter registration drive. But he didn't last long, and then Ella Baker became the full-time executive director. And I think history may have overlooked, she was the first woman to give that kind of executive leadership to the civil rights movement, and she was very effective. She didn't get along very well with the preachers. I'm trying to remember what was at the bottom of that. I don't remember, but she was a strong woman, and there may have been one or two, maybe preachers who had some problems with strong women, like some of you fellows may still in this time have problems with strong women. But she did a good job. She was effective, and out of her leadership and inspiration, students were inspired and organized SNCC, and they became this young wing of the nonviolent civil rights movement.
Let me ask, we're going to turn to that history from 1960 forward in just a minute, but I want to ask one last question about, two questions maybe about this critical period. One is, in your own thinking as it evolved through the 50s, what was your perspective on, you've already touched on this, but can you say a little bit more about the theory of nonviolence and how it connected to your Christianity and to your both tactical and theological perspectives about the movement?
Well, you're right. It had a practical aspect and it had a theological aspect. From the practical perspective, we looked at our army, and weren't many of us. We didn't have any weapons. We didn't have any uniforms. And we looked at the National Guard and the state troopers and the deputy sheriffs and police in cities, and we were outmanned. So that from a very practical perspective, we could not have won a violent confrontation. It would have been catastrophic for us. And it's also interesting that the white organizations, the Ku Klux Klan and others, they didn't know how to deal with nonviolence. They were frustrated because the more they were violent against nonviolent people, the more they were criticized, and the more the world saw them for what they were, and began to sympathize and support even those who may not have first supported sit-ins and direct action were disgusted with the violence, and it turned the tide. The other side, the theological side, was very, because if you notice, the leadership in the movement was almost always preachers and in the churches, and there were two reasons for that. One was the preacher was the most independent leader in the community. He was accountable to the congregation, not to the Chamber of Commerce. And so therefore, he could withstand oppression from the white community, economic oppression as otherwise, better than anybody else. And secondly, the example of Jesus and the teachings, particularly in the New Testament, led us to nonviolence. Jesus on the cross asked his Father to forgive those who had nailed him to the cross. And that spirit of non-violence and non-retaliation and non-hatred of those who had hated you was the thing that we went through, so that theologically we were committed to love and love your enemy, as the New Testament says, and bless those who persecute you. And we discovered that it was not only effective, it was outwardly, but it was effective inwardly for us. We became new creatures because we pursued that theology, and we actually avoided hating. I never forget the 2 or 3 times I met with George Wallace, that he remarked he was astounded by the fact that our spirit was nonviolent and reflected love, or if you couldn't quite make love, we did not reflect hatred in our attitude toward even those who persecuted us. And that was a strange weapon for the white ruffians and even the Citizens Council, who were the respectable, group among the two, but they couldn't understand it, and they tried to call it cowardice, but you couldn't call cowardice people who would walk into the face of the fire and into the face of the beast, unarmed and singing, glory, glory, hallelujah. And that was the power of the movement, and it touched people's hearts everywhere. I remember a white lady saying to me once in Nashville that she was opposed to the direct action movement. She thought it was stirring up trouble. But once she watched how we conducted ourselves and how our oppressors conducted themselves, she said, there's no comparison. The Spirit of the Lord is upon you, and I'm opposed to what they are doing. And she had come a long, long way, because at first she was opposed to, she wanted everything to be settled through the law. But, we never did get a clear judicial interpretation of the sit-ins. I don't think, even to this day, we have a clear-cut opinion from the Supreme Court about sit-ins. But of course, they outlawed segregation in public accommodations, the Congress did, and so forth. So it became a moot question. But But the power of the movement, both in terms of touching those who oppressed us, and in terms of our own spiritual behavior and our spiritual strengthening, it was a great experience for us.
Yeah. Let me also ask you, 59, John's going to switch tracks. Great. We're back on after a quick break. Reverend Lowery, let me ask, obviously through the late 50s, you and others were targeted in a libel campaign meant to obviously harass and knock you back a notch, and it did have its effect. I mean, ultimately the Supreme Court would reach its decision, but that was years down the line. Can you talk a little bit about the personal ramifications of, say, the property seizures and others in 59 for you?
Well, you might talk to my children who, some of them can remember when the officers came and took our car. When they got the judgment, all they could find was my automobile. I was living in the church parsonage, so they couldn't attach my house. And so that was the only thing that was clearly in my name was the automobile. Now, I can say it now, but I lived in Mobile. My home was in Huntsville. And I had inherited, my sister and I, some property from my father in Huntsville. And so we told our attorneys, for God's sake, don't mention Huntsville, because we don't want them to be awakened to the possibility that they might take our property in Huntsville, as they did Abernathy. They took farmland from Abernathy, Marengo County. So the lawyers agreed they did not mention Huntsville. So when I got on the stand in Montgomery, they first asked me, where do you live? I said, 306 North Warren, Mobile. And where were you born? And I almost fainted because we had already agreed, but the lawyer forgot. He was following his routine questioning. And I guess my answer should have been Huntsville, but the Lord spoke to me. And my answer was Madison, because Huntsville was in Madison County. And there was a little town in Madison County named Madison, but I didn't say, I just said Madison. And so they never discovered the property that we had, which they would have seized as they did Abernathy in Marengo County, because they found out about his land. But that was an interesting suit when it was argued before the Supreme Court. One of the justices was Jewish, and the little lawyer, Nachman, who was representing the city of Montgomery, persecuting us. And the New York Times was sued along with the four of us, Abernathy, Shellerwood, Say, and myself. The New York Times would not let us be covered under their bond. They made what they call a supersedus bond. And I'm a little reluctant to buy the New York Times today. I usually read somebody else's. But they would not let us be protected under their bond. And their reason was that if they did, it would give them some stake in Alabama citizenship, and they could be subject to persecution by the Alabama authorities if they had any reason to claim Alabama. Well, they claimed they didn't belong to Alabama. Alabama authorities had no power to attach them. But it didn't help us any. They took our property. And of course, the Supreme Court later reversed the lower courts. And in an argument before the Supreme Court, I was about to say what this lawyer named Nachman was asked by the justice. said, you demanded that the defendants produce their property, and you kept. Sammy Davis had just married, I think her name was Mae Britt, a blue-eyed blonde, and the white folks in Alabama were very displeased with that. And Sammy Davis was on the list of citizens that sponsored the ad that gave them the right to sue in the first place. And when Nachman was making his summary to the jury, he said, you ministers were sitting there with an air of injured innocence. You were proud to be on the stand with Reinhold Niebuhr and Sammy Davis Jr. and with Harry Belafonte and Sammy Davis Jr. They called Sammy Davis' name every other name because that reminded the jurors that Sammy Davis had just married a blue-eyed blonde. And that was very, very unpleasant for the Alabama jurors. And so they didn't stay out very long. They went out and came back almost immediately and found us guilty, and took our property. But the Supreme Court later, of course, vindicated us, overruled the lower court, and when they sold Abernathy's car and Shutterworth's car, and say they all got new cars, but my members were more astute. The Methodists boys, they went down to when they auctioned my car off in Mobile. My members went down and bid. They bid. I think they bought it for $800 or $900, and then they brought it and gave it to my wife. The fellow who did the bidding was a fellow named DeWitt, R.B. DeWitt, who was secretary of the YMCA, which was right across the street from our posses. And he bought it and brought it back and drove it in the yard and gave my wife the key, and she gave him $1. And of course the community raised the $800 or $900 and gave it back to DeWitt that he paid for the car. But I'm the only one who didn't get a new car. those smart, astute Methodists went down and bid for the same car and saved money. But the Baptists let them take the car, and they bought Abernathy and Shuttlesworth and say new cars. I drove my same old car on that. But that's a historic case in libel.
Let's pause for just a moment.
When the Supreme Court said that reversed it, what happened with the property? Did you get the property back? Or?
Yeah, they never took it. He got it, everything. The Supreme Court returned everything. They had to turn back everything. They turned back the money we got that they got for sale of the car. They had to give it back to us, and we gave it back to the organization, which had furnished the money in the first place to reimburse the man who spent it.
Let's pause just one quick sec. Reverend Lowery, you mentioned a few moments ago that obviously when the students get involved in 1960 and the dam sort of breaks with the direct action sit-in movement, the tenor of the movement shifts pretty quickly forward. And I'm really interested in your perspective on that period between early 1960, the Greensboro sit-in say, and that several years through the early sit-in phase, Freedom Rides of 61, Albany, Southwest Georgia, 62, and then the eve of Birmingham in 63, when SCLC will really now take a first step that will really shift SCLC onto the national stage in a very, very dramatic way.
Well, the movement was evolutionary, although it seemed revolutionary at the time. But things changed considerably, and it became a worldwide movement. And it not only dealt with voter registration and public transportation, as it did in the beginning with buses, but it had to do with segregation as a whole. And public accommodations were significant. The court did rule clearly on public accommodations, and in '64, the courts made it very clear that segregation in public accommodation was unconstitutional, and that was a tremendous movement. I remember I was in Nashville in time, may have been '63 or first of '64, I've forgotten which, and we were demonstrating at various restaurants, and we were demonstrating in Morrison's was one of them. Morrison, which is out of business now, and I think they were bought out by Piccadilly. Where do you live?
North Carolina.
Okay, the Piccadilly but there were Morrisons in North Carolina.
Yeah.
But anyway, the fellow who owned Morrison's, I forgot, I think they were based in Mobile. And I was living in Nashville. I went to the governor of Tennessee and asked him to ask the president of Morrison to desegregate, and we could stop the demonstrations. And he called the head of Morrison's, and I was sitting in his office, and he told the head of Morrison, I will never, over my dead body. And the Civil Rights Act took effect, I think, in July of '64. And the Morrison's was desegregated in July, and the president died a month later. So he was true to his word. He said it would be over his dead body that blacks would eat in Morrison's. And he went on and died. I don't think he planned it that way, but that's the way it happened. But by that time, the issue was universally recognized as a new era. And it was, I think the new era began in Montgomery with the boycott. That the Montgomery boycott was the first boycott of an entire community that worked. And that was what I call the beginning of the era of self-determination. It didn't matter what the court said, nor what the legislature said. We were through with the back of the bus. And blacks took responsibility for their fate in their own hands, and decided we weren't going to ride the bus as long as they were segregated. So I think that was the era of self-determination. And later the sit-ins was another expression of self-determination, where we decided we weren't going to permit them to sell us toothpaste and safety pins on one counter. We had to go to a black counter to eat lunch at Woolworths. And I got an award from the people in Greensboro, North Carolina, some years ago. People who were responsible for the sit-ins in North Carolina, which was another expression of self-determination. That you say what you want, of course, we're not eating at the black lunch counter. And so eventually they disappeared.
Just the last couple questions.
Okay.
You're being very generous with your time, and I want to not keep you too long.
All right, I like you. I like the rates you pay.
Okay. Let me ask about when you think about the spring of '65 and Selma. I'd like for you to describe what comes to your mind when you think about that all of Selma and all of that march, and in particular, I'm very interested in how you yourself confronted and dealt with all of the fear associated with facing that kind of situation. It wasn't new to you by then, but nonetheless, it was acute.
Well, it's interesting, as I said to you earlier, that the spirit of nonviolence not only had an impact on the oppressors, but it had a spiritual impact on us. And we became new creatures. That we did not hate Bull Connor. We did not hate the man who killed Dr. King, James Earl Ray. We we wanted them not to spare his life, wanted him not to execute him. It had a spiritual impact on us. And the Selma movement was an interesting movement in that it was after the Birmingham movement that we went to the AG Gas and Motel in Birmingham and held a retreat and decided that we were going to Selma to conduct a campaign to get the vote, because we went to Mr. Johnson and said, we can't vote. And he said, well, we got to slow down, fellas. Said, we just passed the Public Accommodations Act. Said, we can't have another Civil Rights Act this quickly. Y'all take it easy. So we left, went to Birmingham, met in AG Gas and Motel, and planned the Selma movement. Picked Selma because I think SNCC may have been already there, but they had been abused and persecuted terribly. They weren't even forbidden to hold meetings. And also the Black Belt of Alabama was a natural place because it was so black. They said it was black because of the dirt, but I think they called it Black Belt because so many black folk who were majority population. And Dallas County, where Selma was located, was majority black and didn't have but a handful of black registered voters in 1964 and 65. And so the movement was begun in Selma. And the march from Selma to Montgomery, which was the climax of that movement, began after Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed, who was killed in Marion, Alabama. And my wife has a project on the SCLC Women, which she heads. She has put statues and memorials of people like James Reed and Jimmy Lee Jackson and others who died. Jimmy Lee Jackson was the first death in the movement. And we were determined to get the right to vote. And after we had Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral, we were marching to his grave. That's when somebody suggested we ought to march to Montgomery, the state capital, to demand the right to vote. And we did. And that Bloody Sunday they didn't get any further than the bridge. But that next few days, we did go on across that bridge, and in the next few days, we let out for Montgomery, and we reached Montgomery, and you know the rest is history. After the mass meeting in Montgomery that day, when Martin spoke, how long? Not long, and he named a committee to take the demands of the march to Governor Wallace, and he named me chairman of the committee. And Mr. Wallace had sent word he wasn't going to meet with anybody who wasn't from Alabama. And so I was pastoring in Birmingham, so he named me A.G. Gaston, R.Z. Bennington, President Tuskegee, several outstanding citizens of Alabama, to meet with Governor Wallace to discuss the demands of the march. And so I had the demands at the close of the mass meeting, and I went to the general who headed the National Guard and said, I want to take these demands up to the Capitol. So he got on the telephone. I assume he was talking with the governor. And finally he said, go ahead, you can go. But when we got to the steps of the Capitol, the troopers, what I call the Blue Sea, they had on these blue uniforms, they lined the steps of the Capitol and would not let us through. And I know how, who was that, Moses felt when he faced the Blue Sea. It was the Red Sea he faced, but I faced the Blue Sea. We couldn't get through. So I looked back at the general, And I said, pointed to the troopers and said, I thought you said we could go. And he yelled out some military commands. I don't know what he said, up, up. And the National Guard came from around the corner, and they stood in front of the troopers. And they put their bayonets across their shoulders. And the blue sea parted, just like the Red Sea did. They parted, and we walked through and went up to the governor's office. When we got to the door of the Capitol, the governor sent his secretary to say he would take the petition. I said, no. We walked 50 miles. We're not about to give it to the secretary. So I refused to give it to him. And about 4 or 5 days later, the governor called and said he would meet with certain members of the committee. And he picked out some. I was not one of the chairman was not one that he picked to meet with. But I polled the committee, and the committee voted unanimously. It was all or nothing at all. So the next day he called and said he'd meet with us. So he did. He met with us for about 90 minutes. And while we're meeting, the governor had a little piece of paper. He tore up a little piece of paper. And by the time we finished, we had a big mountain of little scraps of paper he had torn up while we were meeting. And I told him that God was going to hold him accountable for how he stood in the way of people making progress and coming together as children of God. But and of course, pretty soon we had the Voting Rights Act of '65, which is probably the most significant piece of legislation in our lifetime, because it changed the whole voting pattern of the nation. And that fellow we have in the White House today would not be there had it not been for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
That's my last question, is to have you reflect a little bit on, of course, you gave the benediction in D.C. I was there that day. I heard you live in person and was very pleased for that opportunity. Just your reflections on how that long arc from Mobile and Birmingham and Montgomery all the way to
Washington.
Yeah.
Well, we're talking the other day, and I noticed first time during the Freedom Riders film, I heard Bobby Kennedy say that there's going to be a black president one day. Now, somebody says he said 40 years. I didn't hear the 40 years, but I did hear him say there'd be a black president. We all felt one day there'd have a black president, but none of us thought we'd live to see it. It just, the way things were at that time, we just couldn't foresee a black president. And here in 19 what year was that? We had anyway. When Barack Obama decided to run, something happened to me spiritually, and I became one of his early supporters when hardly any other civil rights leaders were supporting him. I was out there supporting him, and I just felt like God was moving in history, and the time had come. And I wasn't sure he could be elected, but I thought the time had come for him to run. Unlike Jesse's campaign, which was purely symbolic, none of us ever, nobody ever thought Jesse was going to win. But it was a symbolic run, and it was a good thing. But Barack Obama's campaign took on a different hue. And it appears that he might have a chance to win. And so I went all over the country and went to Selma in March of, what year was that?
2007, I think. Brown's Chapel.
Yeah, Brown Chapel. It was 2007. And I was supposed to speak at First Baptist Church. I had spoken in Brown Chapel the year before. And Barack Obama was scheduled to speak at Brown Chapel. When I got to First Baptist I heard Obama was supposed to speak at Brown Chapel. I got a headache, and I said, I can't. I'm gonna send you somebody. So we sent somebody, and I went to Brown Chapel to hear Barack Obama, and he made an interesting speech. I said in my room, they called on me to make remarks before he spoke. I hadn't counted on that, but I said that I talked about good crazy. There's good crazy and bad crazy. The YouTube picked it up and people have seen it all over the country. But I said that I was going over to Brown Chapel to meet with the crazy people who talk about a black president. And I said, people are saying you're crazy. I said, but there's good crazy and there's bad crazy. And good crazy, is on the right side, and on the right side of history. And he spoke that day, and he said that he represented the Joshua generation. He looked back at me and John Lewis, and he said, you guys represent the Moses generation. I thought that was a sneaky way to call us old, but he was right. And he said he represented the Joshua generation. And something happened in me that this guy is inspired, and I think God is moving. And I decided at that time that I would support him, and I marched across the bridge with him that day, my wife and I together. And then later he came to Atlanta and spoke on the Georgia Tech campus. And he asked me to come out and pray that day. And maybe that's why he got the idea that I might want to pray at the inauguration. But that was at Georgia Tech. And about 25,000 students and people out there. And I went all over the country. He asked me, called me once, asked me if I'd fly to Jackson, Mississippi to speak for him. Couldn't keep it. He and Hillary were supposed to speak. And this daughter here, Cheryl, said she was going with me. They were going to send a plane. And I don't think she knew they were going to send a little small plane, because I didn't know. I'm not sure I would have agreed to go if I had known they were sending such a small plane. But anyway, he sent this little small plane, and we flew over there, and I spoke that night. And I went all over the country, speaking from North Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, Iowa. Matter of fact, after Georgia Tech, I went to Iowa. I wanted to see if the white folks were serious, whether they said they support. I wasn't sure. I know he couldn't win without getting white support. And I went up there. It was getting chilly. And I saw people standing on the corner with red noses and red ears and little signs that said, yes, we can. And I said, God is in this plan. And I went all over the country speaking for him, and he won. And most of my friends, Andy Young and John Lewis, they supported Hillary. They couldn't see it. But I told them it wasn't because they weren't living close enough to the Lord. but we felt it was God's inspired plan. And sure enough, he was elected, and when he called me on my cell phone. And I wasn't there, and he left a message. And when I got the message, he asked me to call him. And I called him back, and I said, I want to speak to the fella who's going to be the 44th president of the United States. And he said, that would be me, Brother Lowery. I said, you called? He said, yes, I called you. I want to ask you if you would give the benediction or the invocation at the inauguration. I said, well, let me check my calendar. And quickly I said, I've checked it, and I'm free that day. I'll be glad to do it. He said, well, we'll call you. Well, he called me. Well, in fact, it appeared in the paper before he called that I was to do the benediction. And some of my friends called and said, no, we're going to protest. We want you to do the invocation. I said, no. I'll take the benediction. and I'll have the last word at the inauguration with the benediction. And of course, people told me in Washington, he said, when you stand on the steeps of the White House, you'll be able to see the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial from that, looking down that mall. And I look forward to it, and I could see a little of it, but there was a slight haze that day, and these old eyes they were about 87 or 88 years old at the time, and they failed me. I couldn't see both the monument and the Lincoln Memorial, but I didn't have to see it because I heard that day from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, I heard the voice of Martin Luther King 40-some years earlier, summoning the nation to come up out of the lowland of race and color to the higher ground of content of character. And here I was witnessing and participating in the nation's response to that summons in the election of Barack Obama. And I think it was God's plan, God's intent, and I think the will of God was fulfilled. And America, I never liked the Star-Spangled Banner. I always thought it was a poor choice for bombs bursting in the air and so forth. But that day when they played it after I gave the benediction, it sounded better than it ever sounded before. And nothing had changed, but the Star-Spangled Banner was the same, but the country had changed. And I was overwhelmed, and I cried. I hate to say I did, grown man. As cold as it was, the wonder my tears weren't icicles. It was cold that day. But the Star-Spangled Banner sounded good that day as it played when they inaugurated the 44th president of the United States.
Reverend Lowery, we're just so grateful for this chance. Thank you so much for coming over to the church today and sitting down with us. You
can send contributions to Post Office Box. What's the institute? Post Office Box 10897. What is it? What is it, Tara?
92801.
Huh?
92801.
Yeah, Post Office Box 92801, Joseph Lowery Institute. We'd be glad to receive contribution from the Smithsonian and from all of its affluent staff and representatives who fly around the country with cameras taking statements.
I think those would be funds well spent. Thank you, Reverend Lowery. It's a real pleasure.
I'm glad to have been here. I'm sorry I was late.
No,
It slipped me. I don't know what it slipped me.
Thank you so much.
It slipped me. You all still here? I won't have to call you, Mother.
Yeah, come on.
You can take me back, okay. They brought me over.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.